This story is inspired by the real case of Judy Smith, 1997, North Carolina, USA. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. In April 1997, Judy Smith, a 50-year-old nurse from Newton, Massachusetts, joined her husband, Jeffrey, on a business trip to Philadelphia. Jeffrey was scheduled to attend a legal conference, and Judy planned to spend her time sightseeing in the city. It was the kind of trip that reminded them both of the quiet joys of married life, an escape from routine. But within days, what began as an ordinary trip spiraled into a mystery that would leave investigators baffled for decades. They had flown into Philadelphia together. Judy was excited. She'd packed casual clothes and mapped out tourist destinations: Liberty Bell, Independence Hall, the Franklin Institute. They checked into the DoubleTree Hotel downtown. But when Jeffrey returned to the room on the morning of April 10th, Judy was gone. Not missing, just out for a stroll, he thought. She had mentioned wanting to explore. But when she hadn't returned by that evening, a quiet unease began to take root. At first, Jeffrey waited. Maybe she got caught up shopping. Maybe she'd lost track of time. But as night fell and no call came, that unease turned into dread. He called friends, then the police. Soon, posters with Judy's face were plastered across Philadelphia. Flyers at bus terminals, airports, train stations. No one had seen her. It was as if she'd simply vanished from the city without a trace. But the most confusing part? Judy's ID, her credit cards, and personal items, none of them had been used. Surveillance footage offered nothing. No known sightings. It made no sense. Why would a woman vanish in broad daylight, leaving behind everything? The search intensified. Dogs were brought in. Canvases were made. Tips trickled in from people who thought they'd seen her. At a coffee shop, in a park, boarding a bus. But none of the leads checked out. A week passed, then a month, and Judy Smith, the kind-hearted nurse who once cared for terminally ill patients, was gone. Then came the twist no one expected. 5 months later, in September 1997, a group of hunters were trekking through the remote woods of Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, nearly 600 miles from where Judy had last been seen. They stumbled upon something that didn't belong: scraps of tattered clothing, a partially buried human skull, and scattered bones. At first they assumed it might have been an animal, but then they saw the bra strap, ripped, with signs of what appeared to be stab marks, and they called the police. Forensic testing confirmed the unimaginable. The remains belonged to Judy Smith. But how did she get from Philadelphia to a remote stretch of forest in North Carolina? There was no record of her traveling. No bus ticket, no flight, no rental car. No one recalled seeing her along the way. The area she was found in wasn't a tourist destination. It was rugged, isolated, accessible mostly by foot or all-terrain vehicle. For investigators, the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why would a woman with no ties to North Carolina end up dead in the middle of a national forest? Even more disturbing, the condition of her remains suggested she hadn't died immediately. Some items, like her backpack and clothes, had been relatively undisturbed by animals, and her bones weren't bleached or worn, implying the death was more recent than her disappearance date. Had she been alive for weeks or even months after leaving Philadelphia? The case had transformed. Judy wasn't just missing. She had died violently, far from home, under circumstances no one could explain. When word reached Jeffrey Smith that his wife's remains had been found, his world collapsed. For 5 months, he had clung to hope, clung to the possibility, however slim, that Judy might reappear, confused or lost, but alive. The news from North Carolina shattered that hope in an instant. But grief was only the beginning. What followed was a descent into confusion and paranoia, as the mystery surrounding Judy's final days began to unfold, and nothing about it made sense. The location where Judy was found baffled authorities. Pisgah National Forest wasn't just remote. It was wild, rugged terrain that stretched across thousands of acres of dense woods, cliffs, and steep trails. Hikers often got lost there. Even seasoned campers approached it with caution. Judy Smith, a woman who had only packed light clothes for a spring trip to Philadelphia, was found over 600 miles away, in hiking gear. How did she get there? And more importantly, why? She had no known connection to North Carolina. Her family confirmed she had never expressed interest in visiting, let alone camping alone in a secluded part of the forest. Yet among the scattered bones, authorities found items suggesting she hadn't simply stumbled into the area and perished accidentally. A blue backpack, thermal clothes, bottled water, a first aid kit. All signs pointed to a person prepared for the outdoors. But Judy wasn't known as a hiker or survivalist. In fact, she had never taken a solo trip of this nature in her life. The autopsy deepened the mystery. While the exact cause of death couldn't be confirmed due to decomposition, forensic experts discovered incisions on her ribs and clothing that were consistent with stab wounds. There was no evidence of animal activity that would explain the lacerations. In particular, the damage to the bra strap was chilling. It bore slices so precise they could only have been made by a blade. Investigators began to lean toward homicide. But if it was murder, then who had taken Judy all the way to North Carolina to kill her in the middle of nowhere? More questions than answers began to haunt the investigation. How had she traveled that far without leaving a trace? There were no flight records, no bus tickets, no eyewitnesses. No one reported giving a ride to a woman matching her description. The idea that she had gone willingly seemed ludicrous to her family. But there was no sign of abduction either. There were no reports of struggle, no missing car, no ransom, no communication. And yet, she had ended up there. Stranger still, several locals in Asheville, the nearest town to the discovery site, came forward to report that they had seen a woman matching Judy's description in early May, weeks after she had vanished. A store clerk swore he had sold a woman outdoor supplies matching those found at the site. A motel worker claimed she had checked in under the name J. Smith. A local bus driver insisted he'd seen her riding a route toward the mountains. All independent witnesses, with no connection to each other, and all convinced they'd encountered Judy long after she was presumed missing. The timeline was breaking apart. If these accounts were accurate, then Judy had not died in April, but had been alive for days, maybe weeks, after disappearing from Philadelphia. She may have even traveled to North Carolina voluntarily. But if that were true, why hadn't she contacted her family? Why didn't she use her credit cards or ID? Why disappear? Was she running from something or someone? The local sheriff's department began working the case as a possible homicide. But as the leads dried up, it became clear that Judy's final journey had left behind no digital footprints, no receipts, and no witnesses who could explain what really happened in the woods of Pisgah. She had arrived, she had survived, and then she had died, violently and alone. The investigators were desperate for answers. Every piece of evidence only seemed to deepen the puzzle. In a world growing increasingly traceable, Judy Smith had moved like a ghost. No bank transactions, no credit card swipes, no known vehicle rentals. And yet, the forensic evidence was undeniable. She had somehow arrived in Asheville, North Carolina, alive. Detectives retraced every possible step. Could she have hitchhiked? Could she have boarded a Greyhound bus with cash? They searched manifests, interviewed drivers, even checked surveillance tapes at major transit hubs. Nothing. If Judy had made the trip from Philadelphia to Asheville, she had done so completely under the radar. And that fact, perhaps more than anything, disturbed the investigators the most. It wasn't long before the public began to speculate. The story of Judy's disappearance and mysterious death gained attention in newspapers and television. Talk radio buzzed with theories. Some believed she had suffered a mental break, dissociating from her life and fleeing into the wilderness. Others were convinced it was foul play, perhaps a kidnapping gone awry. Some went further, spinning elaborate stories of serial killers operating along the eastern seaboard, or of secret pasts and hidden lives. But none of these theories held water against what was known of Judy's life. By all accounts, Judy Smith was stable, grounded, and compassionate. A nurse for over 20 years, she had spent much of her time caring for terminally ill children. Her co-workers described her as calm and patient, someone who always had a smile, someone who brought peace to places filled with fear. Her children spoke of her as a warm, attentive mother. She had no enemies, no debts, no history of running away. Her marriage to Jeffrey had its ups and downs, like any relationship, but there was no evidence of abuse, no arguments before her disappearance. She was, by all outward appearances, happy, and yet one detail began to gnaw at the edges of the narrative: the clothing. When Judy had left for Philadelphia, she had packed light city clothes, slacks, flats, sweaters. But the remains found in Pisgah were clad in hiking boots, outdoor pants, a thermal vest. None of these items were in her luggage. Investigators confirmed that at least some of the items had been purchased in Asheville. So again, the same haunting question returned. Was Judy preparing for something? Was she intending to go into the forest, or being led there? Further interviews with Asheville locals only added to the eerie atmosphere. One convenience store clerk remembered Judy buying trail mix, maps, and water. She had been polite, even cheerful. Another said she asked for directions to a nearby trailhead. No one remembered her seeming distressed. No one reported seeing her with anyone else. She appeared to be alone, purposeful, yet none of it aligned with what her family knew of her. Judy wasn't the type to take spontaneous wilderness trips, let alone into one of the most treacherous parts of the Appalachians. She had no experience in survival or solo travel, and there had been no prior mention, no hint at all, that she planned to do anything other than tour Philadelphia museums while her husband was in meetings. And so, two seemingly incompatible realities began to take shape. One woman, Judy Smith, had kissed her husband goodbye in a hotel room in Philadelphia. That woman had vanished inexplicably into the void. But another woman, same face, same name, had been seen days later in Asheville, North Carolina, gathering supplies, hiking into the wilderness, and ultimately dying in brutal isolation. Could both versions be true, or was there something much darker lying beneath the surface? The silence that followed each new lead was deafening. As investigators struggled to make sense of Judy's two lives, the known and the unknown, they began to realize that the forest had swallowed more than just a person. It had devoured a truth no one could reach. As autumn crept into the Blue Ridge Mountains, the forest where Judy had been found grew colder, quieter, and more haunting. Local hikers began to avoid the area. Whispers of the woman who had walked in and never walked out gave Pisgah an eerie reputation. But while the public spun ghost stories and urban legends, investigators were still confronting a grim and stubborn reality. A woman had died there under violent circumstances, and no one could explain how or why she had ever arrived. Jeffrey Smith, Judy's husband, fell under increasing scrutiny. As is common in missing persons cases, the spouse is often the first person of interest. His account of their last day together had never changed. He had attended a conference meeting that morning. Judy had planned to explore the city. When he returned, she was gone. Security footage from the hotel didn't capture her exit, but gaps in surveillance weren't uncommon in 1997. There was no physical evidence linking Jeffrey to her death. No motive, no past abuse, no insurance policy that would suggest foul play. And he had cooperated fully with law enforcement from day one. Still, some investigators couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Why hadn't Judy left a note? Why didn't she take her wallet or ID? If she had planned to travel all the way to North Carolina, why hadn't she told her husband or children anything beforehand? Could there have been an argument? A hidden secret? Or had she been lured away under false pretenses? One theory emerged, that Judy may have met someone, possibly even in Philadelphia, who convinced her to travel south. Someone charismatic, persuasive, a predator. Investigators began searching through known criminals, sexual offenders, or drifters active between Pennsylvania and North Carolina. But there were no promising matches, no fingerprints at the scene, no DNA, no clue that another person had ever been with her. It was a theory that sounded plausible, but lacked a single shred of proof. Another hypothesis suggested that Judy may have had a psychological break, a spontaneous fugue state. The idea terrified her family. It seemed so unlike her. But psychiatrists brought in by the police admitted that, in rare cases, individuals, especially those under prolonged stress, could suffer dissociative episodes and travel long distances without fully understanding why. Could Judy have suddenly snapped under some internal pressure no one had seen coming? There had been stress in her life. She had recently lost a close patient. Her job as a nurse in hospice care was emotionally draining, and she'd mentioned to a friend that she felt tired, emotionally worn down. But was that enough to make a woman abandon her family, her identity, and ultimately walk into a forest alone? Jeffrey didn't believe it. Neither did her children. To them, the idea of Judy vanishing willingly was as absurd as her being murdered by a stranger. And so they were left with only silence and questions that turned in circles. One particularly disturbing possibility began to settle in the minds of investigators. What if Judy had survived for weeks in the forest? The forensic reports weren't conclusive, but they hinted that her body hadn't been in the woods the full 5 months she was missing. Her skin, though decomposed, wasn't consistent with a springtime death. Her clothes weren't weathered enough. Some items found near her remains, snacks, bottled water, seemed barely touched by the elements. Could she have been alive, hidden somewhere else, only to die in the woods later? If that was true, then someone might have held her. Somewhere. For days. Maybe longer. The idea was horrifying and impossible to prove. And so Judy's story remained trapped between two extremes. Either a woman who vanished willingly into the wild, or a woman who was taken there against her will and left to die. In either case, the forest had become her grave, but not her ending. Because the truth still lingered, somewhere, in the silence between trees, in the shadows of unanswered questions, in the terrifying possibility that whoever had been involved was still out there, watching, waiting, unseen. The deeper investigators looked into Judy Smith's final days, the more the case seemed to reject any logical structure. No matter how many scenarios were laid out, mental breakdown, abduction, premeditated disappearance, none of them neatly aligned with the facts. It was a story full of sharp corners, missing pieces, and haunting inconsistencies. But one thing became increasingly clear. Judy hadn't simply wandered into Pisgah National Forest by accident. Something, or someone, had guided her there. And yet, if she had been abducted, where was the evidence? No one reported suspicious individuals in Philadelphia matching the timeline. No witness saw Judy with a strange man. No fingerprints were found on any of the objects near her remains. There were no signs of struggle in the forest, no ropes, no restraints, no blood. If foul play occurred, it had been clean, eerily so, almost surgical. One local theory began to circulate among law enforcement, quietly passed between deputies and agents behind closed doors. What if Judy had met someone who convinced her to go willingly, not through force, but through trust? The scenario was chilling. A manipulator, a skilled predator, someone who knew how to earn trust fast, someone who saw Judy, kind, empathetic, emotionally tired, and offered her an escape. Maybe it started with a simple conversation, at a cafe, in a park, on the street. "You look like you could use a break," he might have said. Ever been to the mountains? And maybe Judy, unknowingly, stepped into something far darker than she could have imagined. But without hard evidence, it was speculation. And the hardest part for detectives was knowing that the person responsible, if there was one, might have already moved on, traveling under a new name, targeting someone else. And Judy, her voice, her version of the story, was forever lost. To complicate matters, certain elements of the case were oddly contradictory. For example, though her remains were found in a rugged area, they were shockingly close, within just a mile, of a popular hiking trail. In fact, experienced hunters had stumbled across her bones while scouting near a game path used every season. If Judy had died months earlier, how had no one found her sooner? The forest was vast, yes, but the proximity to frequented areas didn't align with how thoroughly she'd supposedly vanished. Then there were the belongings. Her wedding ring was missing, her watch too, but not her clothes, not her backpack. And that detail stung deeply for Jeffrey. Judy never took off her wedding ring, not even in the shower, he told reporters. To him, it was confirmation that something violent had happened, that someone had taken those items as trophies or to erase evidence. It made her death feel even more personal, as if it hadn't been random at all. Over the next year, the FBI reviewed the case alongside state authorities. Cold case experts came in. Crime profilers drew psychological sketches of potential suspects. They revisited the timeline, re-interviewed all the Asheville witnesses. Some insisted they'd seen her alone. Others weren't so sure. One motel owner vaguely recalled seeing her walking down a hallway with a man, tall, bearded, wearing a red flannel shirt, but couldn't remember the exact date. Was it before she died? Or just a case of mistaken identity? Nothing stuck. No suspect was named. No arrests were made. Eventually, the case went cold. But for Judy's family, the ache never did. Her children, now grown, carried her memory into adulthood. Each year they visited the forest, not just the site where her bones were found, but the trails, the overlooks, the winding roads she may have walked. It was their way of connecting to the pieces of her story that still lived, among the trees, the wind, the silence. And in that silence, there was always one question that screamed louder than the rest. Why Judy? Years passed. The forest grew and changed with the seasons, but Judy Smith's case remained untouched, a jagged scar in the timeline of unresolved mysteries. Every so often, a curious journalist would revisit the story. A newspaper would run an anniversary article. A podcast would speculate. But each time the case returned to public consciousness, it faded again, quietly, unsolved, as if the forest itself had swallowed not just her life, but her truth. Jeffrey Smith tried to move forward. He returned to his work as a lawyer, retreated into a quieter life. But those close to him said he was never the same. In interviews, his voice often faltered when he spoke about Judy. "She was my best friend," he once told a reporter. "She didn't deserve to be forgotten." Yet despite his grief, Jeffrey never launched any lawsuits, never publicly blamed law enforcement, and never remarried. It was as if some part of him remained tethered to that forest, searching for closure he knew would never come. But closure, if it existed, never knocked on his door. And over time, the speculation grew darker. Internet forums began dissecting the case. Amateur sleuths dug into old newspaper clippings, police reports, timelines. Some accused Jeffrey himself, despite the total lack of evidence. Others imagined serial killers, secret double lives, witness protection scenarios. The further the case drifted from the facts, the more distorted it became. And yet, hidden beneath the sensationalism, one core truth always remained. Judy had died far from home, in a place she had no reason to be, under circumstances no one could explain. One retired detective, speaking anonymously years later, admitted something chilling. "We had theories, but that was the problem. too many, and not one of them made complete sense. It was like a puzzle with 3 pieces missing from the center. You could build the frame, but you'd never see the picture. And so the questions lingered. Was Judy running from something? If so, what? Was she meeting someone? Had she been lured by the promise of something hopeful? A retreat, a new experience, a sense of peace? Or was she a target, selected by someone who saw in her kindness a vulnerability to exploit? One detail that continued to unsettle those who studied the case was how prepared she had seemed. The items found with her body suggested planning, not panic. Trail snacks, a first aid kit, layers of appropriate clothing. This wasn't a woman who had gotten lost on a whim. This was someone who either knew or had been told what she needed to bring. That one idea refused to die: that Judy had been coached, guided, and then abandoned. The forest, for all its natural beauty, became a symbol of betrayal. In interviews, Judy's daughter once said, "I used to think of the woods as peaceful. Now I think of them as watching, like they know something and won't tell." The official cause of death remained undetermined. The injuries to her clothing suggested stabbing, but with no soft tissue left, no clear weapon, and no forensic evidence tying anyone to the scene, the coroner could not legally declare it a homicide. The death certificate simply read, "Undetermined." That single word haunted everyone who had ever cared about Judy. It meant that her killer, if there was one, had gotten away with it. It meant that the case was no longer being actively investigated. It meant that her children would never get justice. It meant that the forest had won. But perhaps the most heartbreaking theory was the one almost no one wanted to say out loud: that Judy, in a moment of personal crisis, had chosen this ending. That the forest wasn't her prison, but her destination. It didn't make sense, but none of it did. By the 7th anniversary of Judy Smith's disappearance, her case had almost entirely slipped from mainstream media. The world had moved on. New tragedies, new headlines, new disappearances. But for those who loved her, the silence was louder than any breaking news alert. It was the ache of unanswered questions, the pain of a story with no final page. And within that silence, Judy's life became more myth than memory. A woman who smiled often, who gave herself to others through her work, now reduced to theories, timelines, and cold forensic notes. Her children, now adults, never stopped searching. They wrote letters to podcasts, investigators, even private detectives. They organized annual memorial hikes into Pisgah, retracing the winding paths where her remains were found. Each year, they hoped something, anything, might reveal itself. A clue hidden beneath fallen leaves. A forgotten witness. A hiker who remembered a strange encounter. But each year ended the same way, with quiet footsteps echoing through the forest, and the weight of absence pressing down like fog. In one particularly emotional interview, Judy's son recalled a dream he'd had, of walking through Pisgah, hearing his mother's voice calling his name. "I followed it," he said. "I kept walking, but every time I thought I was getting close, it moved further into the trees." When he awoke, he said, he wasn't scared. He was just exhausted. "It's what it feels like all the time," he added. "Like chasing something you know you'll never reach." Despite the emotional toll, Judy's family never gave up hope that someone, somewhere, might still remember something. So they pushed for her case to be featured in documentaries. One such special aired on national television, reigniting interest in the story. Suddenly, old witnesses came forward. A former Asheville store clerk said she remembered seeing Judy buy gear, and possibly speaking with a man, though she couldn't recall his face. A retired ranger mentioned a hiker reporting screams near a trailhead months earlier, but the report had never been formally logged. These were not concrete leads, but they were enough to rattle the case loose from the archives. The FBI quietly re-reviewed their files. A new generation of detectives with fresh eyes took interest. But once again, the evidence was frustratingly thin. Every trail ran cold just a few steps in. There were no suspects, no new DNA, no confirmed sightings after that week in May 1997. And so, investigators turned their attention to the forest itself. New mapping technology was used to reconstruct the area as it had been at the time of Judy's death. Drones scanned the canopy. Soil samples were taken. Specialists in geographic profiling were consulted, attempting to determine how someone could have entered and exited the area without detection. They found nothing, not a single new clue. Eventually, the forest stopped answering again. But even as hope waned, Judy's story continued to whisper. Among true crime circles, her case became a kind of legend. The woman who disappeared from a city and reappeared in the wild. The woman whose final journey was never explained. The nurse who helped others die with dignity, and whose own death was anything but. Each detail became a symbol. The missing wedding ring, the unweathered food wrappers, the careful packing, the silence from her phone, her cards, her identity. The way the forest seemed to keep secrets. In every version of the story, one thing remained the same. Judy Smith was not forgotten. And for those who remembered her, the story wasn't just about how she died, but about the haunting reality of how little we ever truly know about the people we love. About how quickly the familiar can vanish into mystery. Time marched on. Years turned into decades. New technologies revolutionized criminal investigations. DNA databases expanded. Facial recognition improved. Cold case units grew more sophisticated. And yet, Judy Smith's case remained frozen, untouched by breakthroughs that had solved hundreds of other mysteries. It was as if her disappearance existed in a pocket outside time, immune to logic, resistant to closure. In 2016, an independent investigative team revisited the case as part of a docuseries focused on unexplained deaths in national parks. They interviewed former law enforcement, examined the original crime scene photos, and consulted wilderness survival experts. Their findings echoed what had long been suspected. Judy's presence in that area made no natural sense. She was too far off the main trails. Her gear didn't match the climate for the time of year, and the signs of possible stab wounds weren't consistent with any known accidents involving wildlife. But there was one chilling insight the team offered: the possibility that Judy had been brought to the forest already injured or already dying. That she had been left there, either by someone who believed she wouldn't survive, or by someone who never intended for her to be found. And yet somehow, she had lasted long enough to arrange her belongings, to ration her supplies, to perhaps even try to walk for help. They called it the quiet fight, the idea that Judy, even in her final days, had struggled to live. There was no way to prove it, but the notion lingered. In the years that followed, more disappearances occurred in America's vast wilderness. Some were solved, many were not. And each time, true crime enthusiasts brought Judy's name back into conversation. She became part of a pattern, a cautionary tale, a symbol of how easy it is to vanish, even in a world full of tracking devices, cameras, and data trails. But to her family, she wasn't a symbol. She was a real woman, a mother, a wife, a nurse who had given her life to others. They never spoke of her as a victim, only as someone whose story was still being written, even in silence. Jeffrey passed away in 2005. He never saw his wife's case closed. On his desk, found after his death, was a folder labeled Judy. Inside were photocopies of maps of Pisgah National Forest, old police reports, handwritten notes, and a single faded photograph of Judy smiling in front of a lighthouse. On the back, in Jeffrey's handwriting, were 4 words: "Still looking for you." To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to Judy Smith in the spring of 1997, whether she was taken or chose to leave. whether she died quickly or slowly, whether she trusted the wrong person or simply lost her way. The forest where her story ended remains unchanged, vast and indifferent. It offers no answers, only echoes. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. Not the mystery of her death, but the erasure of her life in those final days. The way someone can be here, real and warm and known, and then vanish, without explanation, without justice, without goodbye. Judy's story is not about fear. It's about absence, the kind that gnaws at memory, that stretches across years, that leaves questions as footprints no rain can wash away. In the end, Judy Smith remains what she became on that quiet day in April 1997: vanished.